Welcome. Wherever you are right now, tucked into bed, settled on the sofa, or drifting off with headphones in, we're glad you're here. Tonight, we're going on a journey. Not through space, not through some fantasy world, but through something that millions of people around the world carried in their pockets, their backpacks, and their hearts. Tonight, we're telling the complete history of the Game Boy. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let the story of the Game Boy carry you gently into the night. And before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Few devices in the history of consumer electronics have had the kind of impact that Nintendo's little gray handheld achieved. It wasn't the most powerful device of its time. It didn't have a color screen. The battery cover rattled, and yet, it sold over 118 million units across its lifetime and became one of the defining cultural artifacts of the late 20th century. So how did it happen? How did a simple, almost stubbornly modest device defeat its technologically superior rivals and go on to shape the entire handheld gaming market for decades? That's what we're here to find out. To put the Game Boy's achievement in perspective, at the time of its launch in 1989, portable gaming was not a serious industry. It was a curiosity, a novelty, something for children on long car journeys. The idea that a handheld device could become a cultural force, that it could sell hundreds of millions of units, spawn a global media franchise, and change the way an entire generation related to games, would have seemed absurd to most industry observers at the time. And yet that is precisely what happened. The Game Boy didn't just succeed. It created a new category of human experience. And understanding how it did, that requires us to go back to Nintendo in the early 1980s and to the mind of one quietly extraordinary man. To understand the Game Boy, we first need to understand Nintendo in the early 1980s, a company riding the enormous wave of the Famicom, known in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES had single-handedly revived the North American video game market after the great crash of 1983, and Nintendo was, by the mid-80s, the undisputed king of home console gaming. But there was a problem, or rather, an opportunity. While the NES sat in living rooms and entertained millions, gaming was still fundamentally tethered to the television set. You couldn't take it with you. To fully understand the Game Boy's creation, we need to understand the man who approved it, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nintendo's president from 1949 to 2002, Yamauchi was one of the most consequential figures in the history of entertainment. He was not a gamer. He reportedly rarely played the games his company produced, but he had an almost preternatural instinct for what would sell. It was Yamauchi who insisted the NES include a lockout chip to prevent unlicensed games. It was Yamauchi who approved the Game Boy over the objections of those who thought a color screen was essential. And it was Yamauchi who, time and again, bet on content over hardware, on the game, not the machine. His relationship with Yokoi was one of mutual respect between two very different kinds of genius, one who understood business, one who understood play. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how improbable Nintendo's position was in the mid-1980s. The North American video game market had collapsed catastrophically in 1983, from a peak of $3 billion in 1983 to just $100 million by 1985. Retailers were refusing to stock video games. Consumers had lost faith entirely. Into this graveyard of an industry, Nintendo arrived with the NES, marketed not as a video game console, but as an entertainment system, complete with a robotic peripheral called ROB to reassure skeptical toy store buyers. It worked. The NES revived an industry that most people had written off. By 1987, Nintendo controlled roughly 70% of the American video game market. The question was, what next? But While the NES dominated living rooms, portable gaming was still largely the domain of LCD handhelds, like Nintendo's own Game and Watch series, which had launched in 1980. The Game and Watch devices were clever and charming, but they were single-game devices. Each unit played one game and one game only. What if you could have a portable device that played interchangeable cartridges? What if you could take the NES experience, or something close to it, with you wherever you went? That question was burning in the mind of one man in particular, Gunpei Yokoi. Gunpei Yokoi was one of Nintendo's most important creative figures. He had designed the Game and Watch series, and before that, he had been the man responsible for creating the Ultra Hand, a toy that had first caught the attention of Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi back in 1965 and launched Yokoi's career. Yokoi had a design philosophy he called lateral thinking with withered technology. The idea that you should use cheap, proven, mature technology in clever and unexpected ways, rather than chasing the bleeding edge. It was this philosophy that would shape everything about the Game Boy, and it would prove to be one of the most important design decisions in the history of consumer electronics. Yokoi's philosophy of lateral thinking with withered technology was not simply a cost-cutting measure, though it did keep costs down. It was a genuine design creed. Yokoi believed that novelty for its own sake was a trap, that chasing the most powerful chip, the brightest screen, the most impressive specifications was a race you could never truly win because there would always be something more powerful just around the corner. What mattered was not what the technology could do in a laboratory. It was what it could do in the hands of a player, on a bus, at a school, in a waiting room. The question was always, what experience do we want to create? And then, what is the simplest, most elegant, most reliable technology that can create that experience? It was a philosophy that would be tested, doubted, and ultimately vindicated. Development on what would become the Game Boy began in earnest in the mid-1980s. Yokoi led the project at Nintendo Research and Development 1, working with a small team to figure out exactly what a portable, cartridge-based gaming device should look like and how it should work. The early decisions were deliberately conservative. Rather than use a color screen, which existed but was power-hungry and expensive, the team opted for a simple, reflective dot matrix LCD display. It was the same basic technology you'd find in a cheap calculator. The Game Boy's audio capabilities are The screen was small, just 2.6 inches diagonally, and it displayed graphics in 4 shades of gray. The palette ran from a pale olive green to a murky near black, a consequence of the greenish tint of the LCD panel. Players would come to associate that distinctive color with the Game Boy itself. The processor was a custom 8-bit Sharp chip running at about 4 megahertz. 4 AA batteries would power the unit, and in real-world use, you could expect somewhere between 15 and 30 hours of play. Compared to rivals that would later arrive with color screens and burn through batteries in hours, this was an astonishing advantage. A speaker on the front provided mono audio, and critically, there was a headphone jack, a small touch that made a huge difference. The design of the unit itself was ergonomically considered for its time. A rectangular brick with rounded corners, a directional pad on the left, 2 action buttons labeled A and B on the right, and Start and Select in the center. The unit's internal codename was Dot Matrix Game, DMG, which is why to this day, collectors refer to the original Game Boy as the DMG. The initials also appeared on the circuit board inside every unit. Inside Nintendo, there was some skepticism. The device looked modest compared to what competitors might produce. Yamauchi himself reportedly told the team that if it wasn't going to be color, it had to be absolutely right in every other way. And so they iterated, refined, and polished until they were satisfied. One of the most important decisions made during development was the inclusion of a link cable port, a small socket on the side of the device that allowed 2 Game Boys to be connected together for multiplayer gaming. This was forward-thinking in a way that even the designers may not have fully anticipated. It turned the Game Boy from a solitary device into a social one, and it would lay the groundwork for one of the most significant gaming phenomena of the next decade. The link cable was, in many ways, the hidden genius of the Game Boy's design, a feature that seemed minor at launch, but would eventually prove to be the most consequential decision of all. The Game Boy launched in Japan on April 21st, 1989, at a price of 12,500 yen, roughly equivalent to about $90 at the time. Nintendo had prepared an initial shipment of 300,000 units. They sold out within 2 weeks. The launch lineup included Super Mario Land, baseball, alleyway, and tennis, a modest but solid collection of titles designed to show off what the hardware could do. Super Mario Land in particular was a revelation. A proper Mario adventure on a device that fit in your pocket, with multiple worlds, branching paths, and even a shoot-'em-up level. It was proof of concept. The Game Boy could deliver real gaming experiences, not just toy-grade diversions. Super Mario Land was not simply a port of an existing Mario game. It was a completely original adventure designed from the ground up for the Game Boy. Developed by Nintendo Research and Development 1, Yokoi's team, rather than by Shigeru Miyamoto's group, it featured unique settings inspired by real-world locations: Egypt, China, the coast of France, and a mysterious undersea kingdom. Mario could fly a submarine and pilot a plane. The final boss was not Bowser, but an alien called Tatanga. It was deliberately strange, a Mario game that didn't feel like a Mario game, and it worked beautifully. Its compact worlds, tight controls, and surprisingly catchy music made it the perfect showcase for the new hardware. It sold over 18 million copies, making it one of the best-selling Game Boy games of all time. The North American launch followed on July 31st, 1989. And here, Nintendo made one of the most consequential bundling decisions in gaming history. Rather than pack in Super Mario Land, they bundled it with Tetris, a game originally developed in the Soviet Union by Alexei Pajitnov in 1984. Nintendo's Minoru Arakawa and Bill Lincoln had fought hard to secure the rights for the handheld version, believing it was the perfect game to sell the Game Boy to a broad, non-traditional audience. They were absolutely right. Tetris transformed the Game Boy from a gaming device for kids into something that parents, grandparents, and people who had never touched a video game in their lives found themselves unable to put down. The image of adults on the subway, on planes, in waiting rooms, hunched over a small gray brick playing Tetris, became one of the defining images of late 1980s popular culture. The story of how Nintendo secured the handheld rights to Tetris is itself remarkable. The rights to the game were tangled in a complex web of Soviet bureaucracy, competing licensees, and corporate maneuvering that reads more like a Cold War thriller than a business deal. Henk Rogers, a Dutch game designer working in Japan, traveled to Moscow in 1989, at the height of the final years of the Soviet Union, to negotiate directly with the Soviet software agency Elorg. He did so without authorization, carrying only a business card and a copy of the game. His persistence, combined with clever negotiating, secured Nintendo the handheld rights to Tetris. It was one of the most important licensing deals in gaming history, won by audacity and charm in equal measure. The European launch came in September 1990, and by that point, the device's success was already beyond question. The Game Boy had competitors. The Sega Game Gear launched in 1990. The Atari Lynx had actually beaten the Game Boy to market in 1989, but neither could unseat Nintendo's device. The Game Gear had a color backlit screen and was technically superior in almost every measurable way. The Lynx was even more powerful, but both chewed through batteries at a ferocious rate, and neither had the software library that Nintendo was building. Technical superiority was not enough. Software mattered. Battery life mattered. Price mattered. And the ecosystem mattered most of all. The battery life question deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Sega Game Gear required 6 AA batteries and delivered approximately 3 to 5 hours of play. The Atari Lynx required 6 AA batteries and managed about 4 hours. The Game Boy required 4 AA batteries and delivered between 15 and 30 hours. In practical terms, this meant that a child taking a long car journey with a Game Gear would need to carry a small mountain of batteries. A child with a Game Boy could play for the entire journey and have battery to spare. This was not a minor advantage. In a world before rechargeable batteries were ubiquitous, it was decisive. Parents chose the Game Boy not because they knew the specs, but because they didn't want to keep buying batteries. The original Game Boy's software library was one of the richest in handheld history. Beyond Tetris and Super Mario Land, the library grew rapidly to encompass almost every genre. Super Mario Land 2. 6 golden coins arrived in 1992. A proper Mario adventure with an enormous overworld and the introduction of Wario as a villain. The Legend of Zelda. Link's Awakening arrived in 1993 and remains one of the most beloved entries in the entire Zelda series, a deeply strange and melancholy adventure that dared to do things the console Zelda games hadn't yet attempted. Metroid 2 brought atmospheric, isolating exploration to the handheld. Kirby's Dream Land introduced the pink puffball, who would go on to star in dozens of games. Link's Awakening deserves a moment of its own. Released in 1993, it was developed by a small team at Nintendo, largely on their own initiative, almost a skunk works project by developers who wanted to see what they could accomplish on Game Boy hardware. What they produced was one of the strangest, most emotionally resonant games Nintendo had ever made. Link finds himself stranded on a mysterious island, populated by characters borrowed from other Nintendo games, Goombas, Chain Chomps, even a character named after a member of the development team. The game ends with a revelation so melancholy that many players were genuinely shocked that a Nintendo title could carry that kind of emotional weight. It was proof that the Game Boy could do things no one had expected of it. Before the Pocket arrived, Nintendo had already experimented with color and branding through the Play It Loud range, a series of Game Boys released in bold, striking colors including red, yellow, green, black, and a translucent, clear version that let you see the circuit board inside. The Play It Loud campaign was aimed at an older audience and accompanied by more aggressive marketing, a deliberate effort to signal that the Game Boy wasn't just for children. The clear version in particular became something of a collector's item, its exposed internals giving it a cyberpunk aesthetic that felt genuinely different from anything else in the gaming market at the time. It was Nintendo acknowledging that the Game Boy was a fashion object as much as a gaming device. By the mid-1990s, the Game Boy had been on the market for over 6 years. In consumer electronics terms, that is an extraordinary lifespan for an essentially unchanged device. And so, in 1996, Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket. It was not a new system. It played all the same cartridges as the original. But it was a meaningful hardware revision, smaller, lighter, and considerably more elegant than its predecessor. The chunky gray brick gave way to a sleeker, flatter form factor that actually fit in a pocket without creating an embarrassing bulge. The screen was improved, a true black and white display that replaced the original's greenish tint with cleaner, higher contrast visuals. In the same year as the Game Boy Pocket, something enormous was happening in the software space. Pokémon Red and Pokémon Blue launched in Japan in February 1996, and the world would never be quite the same again. The games had been in development for 6 years, an extraordinarily long development cycle for the era. Under the direction of Satoshi Tajiri, a passionate collector of insects who had dreamed of creating a game that captured the experience of collecting and trading creatures with friends. The link cable, that forward-thinking addition to the original Game Boy hardware, was central to Pokémon's design. You couldn't get all 151 Pokémon in a single game. You had to trade with friends. Satoshi Tajiri's story is one of the most remarkable in gaming history. He grew up catching insects in the rice paddies and streams around his home in Machida, on the outskirts of Tokyo. As his childhood landscape was slowly replaced by urban development, Tajiri found that the natural world he had loved was disappearing. Pokémon was, in a very real sense, his attempt to preserve that experience, to give children who would never explore rice paddies or catch beetles in the summer grass the same feeling of discovery, collection, and wonder that he had felt as a boy. He pitched the idea to Nintendo for 6 years before they agreed to fund it. The development was so difficult and protracted that Tajiri's own studio, Game Freak, nearly went bankrupt before the games were finished. But he held on, and the result changed the world. The result was something unprecedented, a game that was also a social phenomenon. Schoolyards around the world became Pokémon trading grounds, the anime series launched, the trading card game launched, and the Game Boy, already 7 years old by the time Pokémon reached the West in 1998, became indispensable all over again. Pokémon did not become a global phenomenon on the strength of its game design alone, though that design was remarkable. It became a phenomenon because it connected people. Trading, battling, sharing, the Game Boy was a social device in an era before smartphones made social connectivity ubiquitous. In April 1998, Nintendo released a version of the Game Boy that most Western players never owned, and most Western players desperately wish they had. The Game Boy Light was a Japan-exclusive revision of the Game Boy Pocket that added something the original Game Boy had always conspicuously lacked: a backlit screen. Playing the original Game Boy or the Pocket in poor lighting was a real challenge. You needed a lamp, a bright window, or one of the many third-party clip-on lights that became a cottage industry of their own. The Game Boy Light solved this elegantly with an electroluminescent backlight that could be switched on and off. And for the first time, you could play your Game Boy under the covers at night without a torch. The Game Boy Light launched in gold and silver finishes, alongside special editions tied to the Pokémon craze sweeping Japan. It retailed for 6,800 yen, a premium over the Pocket, and sold reasonably well before being superseded just 6 months later by a device that changed everything. For Western players, the Light remains a sought-after collector's item, a tantalizing glimpse of a road not taken, a reminder that Nintendo was always thinking about the problems players faced, even when they chose not to solve them immediately. The cottage industry of third-party accessories that grew up around the original Game Boy's screen limitations is itself a fascinating footnote. The worm light, the Light Boy magnifier, the Fame Power adapter. An entire ecosystem of gadgets designed to compensate for a single design decision. The Game Boy spawned one of the most creative and unusual accessory ecosystems in gaming history. The Game Boy camera, released in 1998, was a tiny camera cartridge that plugged into the top of the Game Boy and let you take low-resolution photos with a fisheye lens. The resulting images, rendered in the Game Boy's 4-shade palette, had an immediately recognizable aesthetic that artists still deliberately recreate today. The Game Boy printer allowed you to print those photos on thermal paper. The Game Boy camera was, for a brief moment, the world's smallest mass-market digital camera. Other accessories included the Game Boy Pocket Sonar, an actual fish-finding sonar device marketed to Japanese anglers, and the Barcode Boy, which let you scan barcodes to generate in-game items. Nintendo's willingness to experiment with the platform's capabilities was extraordinary. October 1998. The Game Boy Color arrived, and with it, a genuine generational leap for Nintendo's handheld line, though one carefully designed to maintain backward compatibility with the enormous existing Game Boy library. The screen displayed a palette of 32,768 colors, showing up to 56 simultaneously in color-specific games. The processor ran at double the speed of the original. RAM was quadrupled. But Nintendo had made a careful and commercially savvy decision. The Game Boy Color was backward compatible with the entire original Game Boy library. Every cartridge you'd ever bought still worked. And original games, when played on the Color, received an automatic color palette. A nice touch that made older games feel somewhat refreshed. One of the more charming features of the Game Boy Color was its automatic colorization of original Game Boy games. When you inserted an original gray cartridge, the Color would apply a preset color palette to the game, giving it a faint wash of color that made older games feel refreshed. And Nintendo had hidden a secret inside this system. If you held different button combinations at the startup screen, you could unlock different color palettes: red, blue, green, and others. It was a small Easter egg, a little gift from Nintendo's programmers to curious players. The kind of charming detail that made Nintendo products feel like they were made by people who genuinely loved games and wanted to reward the players who paid attention. The Game Boy Color launched alongside Pokémon Yellow, and was soon followed by Pokémon Gold and Silver, widely considered among the greatest Pokémon games ever made. Gold and Silver introduced 100 new Pokémon, a day and night cycle, breeding, held items, and an entire second region to explore after the main story. They were a staggering achievement in Game Boy game design and sold over 23 million copies worldwide. The Color era also produced the Linked Zelda Adventures, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, Metal Gear Solid, Ghost Babel, Dragon Warrior Monsters, and the technically stunning Shantae, released in 2002 after the Game Boy Advance had already launched as a final love letter to aging hardware. Among the Game Boy Color's most remarkable games were several that pushed the hardware in ways no one anticipated. Kirby Tilt and Tumble, released in 2000, contained a built-in tilt sensor in its cartridge. You physically tilted the Game Boy to roll Kirby around the levels. It was the kind of innovative hardware experiment that Nintendo would return to repeatedly in later years. The Pokémon Pinball cartridge contained a rumble motor, another cartridge-level innovation. And Wario Land 3 demonstrated that the Color's processor could sustain smooth animation and large sprite work at a genuinely impressive level. The Color era was short, barely 3 years before the Advance arrived, but its library rewarded players who took the time to explore it fully. June 11th, 2001. The Game Boy Advance launches in North America, and the handheld gaming world changes overnight. Here, finally, was a device that represented a true generational leap, not a modest incremental improvement, but a fundamental reimagining of what a Nintendo handheld could do. The Game Boy Advance was powered by a 32-bit ARM processor running at 16.8 MHz, roughly equivalent to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in terms of graphical capability. The device was in many ways a portable Super Nintendo, and developers didn't waste any time proving it. It sold 81,000 units on its first day in North America, and over 13 million units worldwide by the end of 2001. The screen measured 2.9 inches diagonally, and for the first time, the Game Boy adopted a landscape orientation, wide and flat, with the screen in the center and buttons on both sides. Two new shoulder buttons, L and R, opened up new gameplay possibilities. The device was backward compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges. There was, however, one significant criticism that would haunt the Game Boy Advance throughout its original run. The screen was not backlit. In anything less than ideal lighting, the conditions most people actually played handheld games, it was painfully dim. Third-party worm lights and clip-on illuminators sold in enormous quantities, but they were awkward solutions to a problem that Nintendo should have addressed internally. What the Game Boy Advance inspired in its developers was remarkable. Given hardware roughly equivalent to the Super Nintendo, studios set about creating some of the most accomplished 2D games ever made. Capcom produced stunning ports of Street Fighter and Mega Man. Square brought Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to the platform. Intelligent Systems used it to introduce Fire Emblem to the West. Konami crafted extraordinary Castlevania entries, and smaller studios used the platform as a creative proving ground, producing original games of real ambition. The GBA was for several years the premier platform for 2D game development in the world, at a time when the rest of the industry was rushing headlong into 3D. The games that emerged from that era have aged far better than most of their contemporaries. Where to begin? The Game Boy Advance library is almost embarrassingly rich. Super Mario Advance and its sequels brought beautifully adapted Mario classics to the handheld. The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past received a definitive handheld port. Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald introduced the third generation. Golden Sun and its sequel were RPGs of staggering ambition. Castlevania, Aria of Sorrow, refined the Metroidvania formula. Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission brought Samus back brilliantly. Fire Emblem made its Western debut. And Mother 3, released in Japan in 2006, never officially localized in the West, is considered by many to be one of the greatest RPGs ever made. A deeply strange and emotionally devastating game that took the GBA to its absolute limits. Fire Emblem's Western debut on the Game Boy Advance in 2003 is a story of unlikely salvation. The series had existed in Japan since 1990, with 12 entries released domestically before the West ever played one. Western fans knew of the series only because its characters, Marth and Roy, appeared in Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64 and GameCube. Confused by the appearance of characters from games they couldn't play, Western fans began lobbying Nintendo to localize the series. Nintendo agreed to try a single entry with no expectation of massive sales. It sold over 1 million copies. The sequel, The Sacred Stones, followed quickly. Fire Emblem is now one of Nintendo's most important franchises globally, with Awakening and Three Houses both selling over 3 million copies. It all started with that modest GBA cartridge. Mother 3 deserves special mention. The sequel to Earthbound, the cult SNES RPG that found a devoted following in the West, Mother 3 had been in development since the mid-1990s, passing through multiple canceled versions before finally arriving on the Game Boy Advance in 2006. It is, by the accounts of everyone who has played it, extraordinary. A game of genuine emotional depth, darkly comic writing, and a final chapter that left many players in tears. Nintendo has never released it in English. A fan translation was completed in 2008 and remains the definitive way for Western players to experience the game. The campaign to convince Nintendo to officially localize it continues to this day, a testament to the passion the Game Boy Advance inspired and to the power of games that refuse to be forgotten. Nintendo heard the criticisms about the GBA's screen. They heard the cries for a backlight, and in February 2003, they delivered. In the most dramatic fashion possible. The Game Boy Advance SP didn't just add a backlight to the Advance, it reinvented the form factor entirely. The SP adopted a clamshell design, a folding device that closed to protect the screen, with the screen on the top half and the controls on the bottom. When closed, it was roughly the size and shape of a small paperback book. When open, it was a proper gaming device with a bright, beautiful front-lit screen. After years of squinting at dim displays, players could finally see their games clearly in any lighting condition. The SP also replaced the 4 AA batteries of the original Advance with a built-in rechargeable lithium-ion battery. Battery life was approximately 10 hours with the light on, or 18 hours with it off. There was one puzzling omission: the headphone jack. To use headphones, you needed a proprietary adapter, a decision that remains baffling to this day. A later revision, the AGS 101, replaced the front light with a true backlit screen that was even brighter and more vibrant. The AGS 101 is widely considered the finest screen of any Game Boy Advance hardware and is prized by collectors. Distinguishable only by a small 101 on the packaging, many buyers didn't even realize they were getting a significantly upgraded device. The SP launched in a range of colors and spawned a remarkable number of special edition variants over its lifespan. Pokémon-themed editions, a Famicom-themed model that paid homage to the console that started Nintendo's gaming empire. Star-patterned editions, translucent editions, limited releases tied to specific games and anniversaries. Nintendo had discovered, with the Play It Loud range and the Game Boy Color's translucent shells, that the Game Boy was a fashion object, something players wanted to personalize and display. The SP leaned into this with enthusiasm, and the result was a hardware life cycle rich with collectible variants that are still hunted by enthusiasts today, decades after the platform's commercial peak. By 2005, Nintendo was already deep into development of the Nintendo DS, but before that transition completed, they released one final piece of Game Boy Advance hardware, and it was unlike anything that had come before. The Game Boy Micro was tiny, almost absurdly so. A sleek, palm-sized device that measured just 10 centimeters wide and barely 5 centimeters tall, weighing 80 grams. By a considerable margin, the smallest and lightest device in the Game Boy line's history, it was also in many ways the most beautiful. An aluminium shell that felt solid and premium in the hand, with interchangeable faceplates and a screen of extraordinary clarity. The Game Boy Micro screen was a genuine marvel. Just 2 inches diagonally, but with a pixel density that made it the sharpest, most vibrant display ever put in a Game Boy. A true backlit LCD with adjustable brightness and colors that popped with vivid clarity. Playing Game Boy Advance games on the Micro was, visually, the definitive experience. The contrast between this tiny device's superb screen and the original Advance's dim, unlit panel was almost comically stark. Here, finally, was everything the GBA library deserved. Crisp, bright, beautiful presentation in a device you could genuinely carry anywhere. Many players who bought the Micro specifically for the screen ended up rediscovering games they had played on the original Advance as if for the first time. Commercially, the Micro was a disappointment. The Nintendo DS had already launched and was selling at an extraordinary pace. The Micro launched at $99.99, the same price as the original GBA 4 years earlier, but offered less functionality than the SP for the same money. It was not backward compatible with original Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridges. Today, however, the Game Boy Micro is a cult object. Its combination of exceptional build quality, beautiful screen, and rare commercial underperformance makes it a prized collector's item. The Famicom-themed special edition released in Japan, in red and gold, with controller iconography on the faceplate, is genuinely rare. It was the perfect swan song, exquisite, a little impractical, and quietly unforgettable. Across its 16-year lifespan, from the launch of the original DMG in 1989 to the discontinuation of the Game Boy Micro in 2007, the Game Boy family sold over 200 million units worldwide when you count every iteration. What made the Game Boy great? It wasn't always the technology. The original was technologically outclassed on day one. The Advance lacked a backlight for 2 years. The Micro sacrificed compatibility for elegance. And yet each device found its audience, built its library, and left an impression that outlasted its commercial life by decades. Part of the answer is software. Nintendo understood, better than almost anyone in the industry, that the games are the product. The hardware is the delivery mechanism. The Game Boy's cultural footprint extends far beyond sales figures. It shaped the aesthetics of an entire generation. The olive-green glow of that original screen, the chunky, pixelated sprites, the 4-channel chiptune audio that composers used to create some of the most memorable music in gaming history. The Game Boy sound chip, limited to 4 channels of audio, inspired an entire genre. Chiptune music, which artists continue to create and perform to this day, using original Game Boy hardware. The device has appeared in art galleries, music festivals, academic papers, and feature films. It was carried into space on the space shuttle. A Game Boy that survived a bombing in the Gulf War. Its screen destroyed, but still functional. Sat on display in a Nintendo store in New York for years. The Game Boy was not just a product. It was a companion. The story of Gunpei Yokoi's later years at Nintendo is tinged with sadness. In 1995, Nintendo released the Virtual Boy, a tabletop stereoscopic gaming device that Yokoi had developed. It was, by almost any measure, a failure. The red and black visuals caused headaches and eye strain. The games were limited. The device was awkward to use and impossible to play portably. It sold fewer than 800,000 units and was discontinued after less than a year. Yokoi, who had been one of Nintendo's most celebrated figures for 3 decades, stepped down from the company in 1996, the same year the Game Boy Pocket launched, the same year Pokémon arrived. He founded his own company and began work on a new handheld. He died in October 1997. His legacy is immense. The man who gave the world the Game Boy, who saw the Game & Watch line through its entire run, and who left Nintendo in circumstances that remain a matter of quiet reflection among gaming historians. Part of the Game Boy's legacy is the link cable and the social dimension it enabled. Pokémon did not become a global phenomenon on the strength of its game design alone, though that design was remarkable. It became a phenomenon because it connected people. Trading, battling, sharing. The Game Boy was a social device in an era before smartphones made social connectivity ubiquitous. And part of it is simply nostalgia. The particular, irreplaceable quality of the memories we form in childhood. For a generation of players, the Game Boy was their first gaming device, their first Pokémon, their first Zelda, their first glimpse of what games could be. That kind of memory doesn't fade. So where does Nintendo stand today in the handheld market? The answer is both simple and profound. They've collapsed the distinction between handheld and home gaming entirely. The Nintendo DS succeeded the Game Boy line in the mid-2000s, with its dual screens and touch input, creating an entirely new paradigm for portable gaming. The DS family sold over 154 million units and produced some of the finest games ever made. New Super Mario Bros., Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, The Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, Professor Layton, and countless others. The Nintendo 3DS followed in 2011, adding glasses-free stereoscopic 3D to the dual-screen formula, selling over 76 million units over its 9-year lifespan. The Nintendo 3DS deserves more than a brief mention. It launched in 2011 to a rocky reception, expensive, with a launch library that failed to excite and a glasses-free 3D effect that many players found more gimmick than feature. Nintendo slashed the price within 6 months, and as an apology to early adopters, offered them 20 free games from the NES and Game Boy Advance eras. The 3DS then found its footing through extraordinary software. Fire Emblem Awakening effectively saved the Fire Emblem series from cancellation, becoming a million seller. A Link Between Worlds reinvented Zelda's dungeon structure. Pokémon X and Y brought the series fully into 3D for the first time. The 3DS proved once again that Nintendo could turn a slow start into a lasting success through the power of great games. The truly seismic shift came in 2017 with the launch of the Nintendo Switch. A 6.2-inch tablet with detachable controllers, it docks into a base station connected to your TV, instantly transforming your handheld gaming session into a living room experience. As of 2024, it has sold over 140 million units, making it Nintendo's best-selling console of all time, surpassing even the Wii. Its library includes games that are unambiguous all-time classics: Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Hollow Knight, Hades, Animal Crossing: New Horizons, and Metroid Dread. The Nintendo Switch 2 has launched in 2025, continuing the line that Gunpei Yokoi began so modestly in 1989. The Switch's cultural impact was perhaps best illustrated by Animal Crossing: New Horizons, which launched in March 2020, days before much of the world entered lockdown. New Horizons sold 13 million copies in its first 6 weeks. For millions of people suddenly confined to their homes, it offered something almost miraculous: a gentle, social, endlessly customizable world to retreat into. Friends visited each other's islands. Players sent virtual gifts. People who had never played a video game in their lives bought Switches specifically to play it. It was a moment that demonstrated, as powerfully as anything since Tetris, that the right game at the right moment can transcend the medium entirely and become a place people go to feel connected, calm, and at home. What's remarkable is how clearly the thread runs from Gunpei Yokoi's lateral thinking with withered technology to the Switch. Nintendo has never been the most powerful hardware manufacturer. They have never tried to win a specs war. Instead, they've consistently asked, what experience do we want to create? What is the most elegant way to create it? What do players actually need as opposed to what they say they want? And time and again, that philosophy has led them to create devices that outlast their competitors, build libraries that become cultural touchstones, and forge connections with players that last a lifetime. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Game Boy's legacy is its continuing presence in gaming culture today. Not as a museum piece, but as an active platform. The Analog Pocket, released in 2021, is a modern Game Boy-compatible handheld that plays original cartridges on a high-resolution display, and it sold out immediately upon announcement. ROM hacks and fan translations of Game Boy games continue to be released regularly. The game development tool GB Studio allows anyone to create new games for the original Game Boy hardware. The history of the Game Boy is, ultimately, a story about what happens when you get the fundamentals right. Not the specifications, not the feature list, the fundamentals, great games, accessible design, reasonable price, and, above all, an understanding of what players actually want from a gaming experience. Gunpei Yokoi, the father of the Game Boy, died in 1997, struck by a car on a motorway in Japan, just a year after the Game Boy Pocket had launched, and while Pokémon was beginning its conquest of the world. He didn't live to see the full flowering of the phenomenon he had set in motion, but his philosophy, his insistence that clever thinking matters more than raw power, lives on in every Nintendo handheld that followed. Pokémon's journey from Game Boy cartridge to global phenomenon took another extraordinary turn in 2016 with the launch of Pokémon Go. Developed by Niantic using Nintendo and Game Freak's IP, Pokémon Go used smartphones' GPS and camera capabilities to overlay Pokémon on the real world, allowing players to catch creatures in their local parks, streets, and landmarks. It became the fastest mobile game to reach 100 million downloads in history. For a few weeks in the summer of 2016, it seemed like the entire world was playing it. People were walking into fountains. Traffic jams formed outside rare Pokémon spawn points. Hospitals reported patients recovering faster because they were motivated to walk the corridors. Satoshi Tajiri's childhood dream of getting people to explore the world through creature collecting had, in the most unexpected way, come true again. From the pale olive-green glow of that first DMG screen in 1989, through the clean lines of the pocket, the backlit luxury of the light, the vibrant colors of the color, the 32-bit leap of the Advance, the clamshell elegance of the SP, and the tiny perfection of the Micro. The Game Boy line was, from beginning to end, a testament to thoughtful design and the enduring power of great games. Over 118 million units, thousands of games, billions of hours of play, and memories, deeply personal, irreplaceable memories that an entire generation carries with them to this day. Not bad for a small gray brick. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the complete history of the Game Boy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and sharing it with a fellow Nintendo fan. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Which Game Boy was your first? What's your favorite Game Boy memory? Was it finally catching Mewtwo, staying up past midnight to finish Link's Awakening, or beating your friend at Tetris over the link cable? Drop it all below. We read every comment. Until next time, sweet dreams and happy gaming.